Good morning. We've rung the bell in the Henry King tradition and we want to start our program. Thank you all for coming on a Saturday morning. This is always a little tough, especially when there are a lot of other things, including sleeping in on your agenda. But we have a really terrific panel. Yesterday, we talked, among other things, about energy, climate change, and what kept coming up, as you probably recall, was the transportation sector. We ended up talking about cars, the amount of energy that transportation takes up, whether it's fossil fuels or potentially other fuels. This is a panel this morning to focus on the transportation sector in two very important ways, both freight transportation and also vehicle transportation. And we have a terrific panel this morning to give us two very important perspectives. Our first panelist is Kim Hill. Kim is the Director of Sustainability and Economic Development Strategies at the Center for Automotive Research in Ann Arbor. He's part of the Automotive Communities Partnership, which is an important initiative to take a look at how communities are adjusting to changes in the auto sector, and he brings with him a perspective of what this looks like for the people who make cars, the people who are involved in the supply chain, as well as the communities themselves and the impact that vehicles have on them. Following Kim, we'll have a presentation by Benjamin Teitelbaum. Benjamin is someone I've known for quite a while. I'm very pleased to have him here. He's with the Commission on Environmental Cooperation that is part of the North American sort of NAFTA institutions, and he is a special assistant to the Commission with responsibility in the last few years for looking at sustainable freight transportation, and something that's been worked on by all three governments, but most importantly, the CEC is bringing a lot of new ideas to it, and so we're looking forward to hearing from both of them. With that, let me turn it over to Kim.
All right, thanks, Chris. Okay, so I guess we want to get going because I hear that Dan, our esteemed host, has a baseball game to get to later, so I'm just going to keep things moving along. Yeah, he gave me a great vote of confidence. I saw him yesterday and he said, you know, it looks like we got a great lineup today. There's going to be a lot of folks here on Saturday morning, so don't screw up. So I said, okay, all right, well, thanks. I think I can do that. And then as the night went on last night, he kept saying to me, oh, there's my 9 o'clock, there's my 9 o'clock. And then he'd say, well, there's my 9 o'clock, what are you drinking? And it went like that till I peeled myself away. And so anyway, here I am, and I have Dan to thank wherever he is. He's laying low. Okay, so you know, as Chris alluded to, there was a big elephant in the room yesterday, I think, with the climate change and the use of energy was, you know, what's the transportation sector? A lot of folks point to the transportation sector as as either part of the solution or the cause of the problem. You know, as all of you who got here one way or another, we can't do without transportation, and I would guess that a good 85% of you couldn't do without your car to get here. So what I'm going to do is give you a view from the auto sector, and in this region, make no mistake about it, for those of you who aren't from around here, the auto sector is the main driver of the economy. Without automotive, Cleveland wouldn't be here. A lot of other towns would not even exist. So if the auto sector goes away, goes offshore, goes somewhere else, there's a lot of, we have a lot of problems. Yeah, I was struck by a lot of things that were said yesterday. And I was scribbling down a lot of pithy comments, and by the time the day wore on, most of my comments have been covered. But I did have one that kind of shines through, and in the work that we do a lot, you know, it strikes me that there's a political element to something that should be very market-driven. You know, I can see where the politics get involved, the policies and the like, to you know, kind of help people make some decisions in that. But I'm struck that, you know, and hold on to your seats, all right? The politicians aren't the smartest group of people when they get together. These are the folks who said, well, we'll solve the budget problem. We're going to reduce, you know, take a lot of money out of the budget. And in fact, what they ended up doing was slashing a lot of money out of the budget that wasn't going to get spent anyway. I don't know if you've been following this thing just recently, but there's billions of dollars that they said, hey, we can make these cuts, you know, but we weren't going to spend it on the census anyway. So what does strike me is a very easy solution, and I hear this from folks in the car companies, I hear this from folks that I work with, a lot of people, a lot of you folks have already said it, is if we put a price on carbon. We put don't call it a tax, because that's a bad word, apparently. Again, these are people that are sent to Washington to make some kind of sort of change, and they cannot start a conversation on what seems to be a no-brainer to everybody who steps back from this, is make the price of gasoline a certainty, and the auto industry and the consumers will respond. Right now, Exxon and the like, BP, are the ones who are setting our energy policy. So, as I see it, you put a fee on carbon, take the revenue from that fee, pump it back into the companies that can most use that R&D money to help people avoid that fee. So if you tax gas, put it back into R&D on making more vehicles that can get better mileage, you're giving people a means of avoiding that tax. It seems like a no-brainer. It seems very simple. I know a lot of you folks in the room would say, you know, it's not that simple, but it is in premise, but you got to start talking about it. All right, so one of the things Chris said that I do, the Center for Automotive Research, and our organization is based in Ann Arbor, a city Dan had a lot of trouble mentioning yesterday. I don't think he ever actually said Ann Arbor coming out of his mouth, so I made sure that I said it a lot in front of him. So we're, you know, Center for Automotive Research is a nonprofit, independent research organization focused on, obviously, the auto industry and, you know, what's going on in the industry and how it affects all the stakeholders in that industry. So we do some of our work for the auto companies, but a lot of work for state and local governments, foundations, just a lot of folks who want to understand where is the industry going, what's it going to look like 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years from now. And so with that, I direct a program at CAR, the Automotive Communities Partnership, and if this is in its 10th year now. We have communities and companies working together on enhancing the automotive endowment, again, helping the economy of this region. We have widespread participation from Ontario all the way to Illinois, 35 and counting regional economic development organizations representing 50 counties. This map signifies. We have cooperation from utility companies, automobile companies, suppliers, just a lot of different folks. Organizations like the Canadian Consulate are actively involved in our program. We provide a lot of analyses, objective advice. We point out best practices when we see them. We provide forums on topical issues and actions, and we help provide communities with needed industry information. And most importantly, we try to get them to collaborate on that common mission. So it's been a great run, and it works out very well. The reason it works out very well is because the industry is highly integrated throughout the region. Each one of those dots is connected to every one of those other dots. You cannot build a motor vehicle in a vacuum. You need parts and supplies and people from across a region to make sure that an automobile gets assembled. Okay, so the point of the conference, energy, climate change, and the like, as I see it at the moment, there's three main energy issues that sort of interweave with the auto sector. One is the energy efficient transportation. We're seeing investments from the private and public sources. What's the industry's energy demand, and where's that energy sourced from? You know, we look at things like greening the manufacturing supply chain, and I think my colleague on the panel will be talking a little more about the supply chain as well. And then the supply chain and disruptions, most notably the earthquake in Japan. You know, there was issues with the supply chain and the spread of it and the transport costs and the fuels and risks inherent in it well before a major event like this happened. And so now we're questioning what are the lessons from the earthquake? Are we going to rethink globalization? So anyway, I like to look at this manufacturing process chain as 3 points. One is vehicle efficiency. Two is the manufacturing process chain, if you will, and it's all the materials, the services, the supply chain goods, everything that goes up to that upper right-hand box where the vehicle is actually manufactured. That's all comes into it. And on top of overlaying all of that is the transportation sector, the movement of goods and people. And then finally, the energy that the industry demands to make the vehicles and to be able to drive them. So just a couple of little graphs that we like to point out. This is what we commonly call to as an inverse relationship. Price of gas goes up. Traditionally, the Detroit 3 market share went down. And it's correlated highly significantly over time. Every time you see a spike in gas, you get to late 70s, and I know a lot of you were around then. Late 70s it was when the imported vehicles first started really showing up en masse. Market share for the Detroit 3 went from close to 90% of the market in the 1970s to less than 50% today. That's an astounding drop in market share. One, because the competition was out there, but when you look at a graph like this, it's the non-response to market signals that the auto companies were not prepared a number of times. We think they are prepared this time. So what have they been doing? They've been working on energy efficient vehicles. We had a big price shock a couple of years ago, and then the economy tanked, but a couple of years ago, price of gas hit $4 a gallon, and now we're right back there. However, in the last couple of years, there's been some major reinvestments. There's been a couple of bankruptcies from the auto companies, some restructuring, some cutting of costs. However, on the opposite side of that have been some major investments. The federal government finally has stepped in and helped on the research and development of, again, a very key industry to this nation's economy. The federal government has stepped in and helped in a number of other industries, but they've been very reluctant to assist the auto industry in the basic research. But they have not resisted in telling the auto industry what to make all the way along. Make it, but we're not going to give you any money for it. Finally, some money has come onto the table. And the auto industry has responded. Internal combustion engines have made remarkable strides toward efficiency, and it continues. Electric vehicles, these are all answers to a question, and my premise is no, not one of them is the answer. I don't know if our DOE person is in the room from yesterday, but there's been an overemphasis on this second one here. Electric vehicles, clean until you factor in the source of electricity. So depends where you drive your car. If you're driving it in Kentucky or Tennessee, it's a real dirty vehicle. Why? Because you get your electricity from a coal-fired plant. If you drive it in Louisiana, it's very clean. Why? Because they have nuclear power. So it just kind of bounces around. It's a moving target. Diesel, 30% more efficient. You cut down your greenhouse gases, but there's the low-level smog is the problem, the NOx and the SOx. The fuel cells, 10, 20 years away. In 1990, fuel cells were 10 years away, 20 years away. In the year 2000, fuel cells were 10 or 20 years away. Today, they're 10 or 20 years away. It's a complex problem, but I've seen vehicles, some test vehicles, prototypes and the like that have moved in that direction. Compressed natural gas, we heard about that. Domestic source of fuel, fracking is a word we're all starting to become very familiar with. How do you deliver it? Other fuels and technologies, biofuels, they're great, right? Until somebody's planting something in their field and it doesn't go to your mouth, it goes to your gas tank. That's not a very good picture. You don't want to see that picture, that we're powering our SUVs rather than powering our stomachs or our brains. So case in point, okay, electric vehicles. Deployment of selected electric vehicles, 3 major manufacturers, Chevy with their Volt, Nissan with their Leaf, and the Ford Focus electric. We looked at this and said, where are these vehicles going to show up? This is a little side project that we did and found that they're going to launch in a number of states initially. Where next and why? This was the ultimate question, is where else are they going to go and why? Well, electric vehicles have hardly been selling, so we don't know. There is no pattern yet. However, we looked at hybrid registrations and said, well, maybe that will be a proxy for that.
Yeah.
And so the retail hybrid registrations are, as you can see, the orange states are very high. When we standardize that to hybrids per 10,000 residents, you can see it's pretty high on the West Coast, on the East Coast, in Colorado. And then we looked at, well, you know, what was it that kind of spurred hybrid purchase and consumers to get them? Well, there's a lot of incentives across the states, and we looked at all 50 states, found that, you know, there's 12 major incentive type programs, and in the 50 states, there was, as we totaled them all up, there was 59 government incentive packages across the 50 states and 51 you know, private type incentives, insurance and the like. Then we looked at the top 10 states per saturation of per 10,000 vehicles or per 10,000 people. And so in the top 10 we found, you know, this isn't very scientific, but we did find that the more incentives that you offer, the higher adoption rate there is in a state. So that's probably not a no-brainer, but you know, we were able to kind of you know, show that there is a statistical significance to that here. So as hybrids go, will electrics? You know, that's the question. We think that that's probably how it will go, is that electrics will sell to people who trade in their hybrids to get an electric vehicle. But what's it going to take? Okay, so government industry partnerships, clean city programs through DOE, another EV project. This is all installing charging stations in a lot of places. You know, money being thrown out there to put in public and private charging stations, and then there's some programs across the cities to enhance some of these type vehicles. So what's happened is, you know, a map like this tends to pop up, the hydrogen and electric fueling stations, and you look at that, strikes us. You know, there's a lot of concentration over on the West Coast, a lot of concentration over on the East Coast. Anybody know how the political system works, and certainly how they get their hands in on automotive? Who's making the decisions and who's driving the policies in Washington? The guys on the West Coast and the guys on the East Coast. So out here, we think that a short-range electric vehicle to drive from Ann Arbor to Cleveland is a no-starter. Maybe to go from around campus here to go downtown to the baseball game later today, it works. But, you know, it's not really the solution, but that's what we're being given as the solution, being pushed in that direction. You know, you need an electric charging infrastructure, either you know, you need private for sure. For anybody that's going to buy a vehicle, you need a way to charge it. You need to have something at your home. Public charging stations are less of a concern if you can buy your vehicle and use it within the range, you know, within the 40 to 90 mile per charge range. If that works for you, public charging is not necessary. So our hybrid sales really a proxy for electric vehicle sales. Again, if they are, there's a lot of money being put in a basket that's not going to result in a lot of things. So we looked at what have the companies announced. We took 3 major companies, the ones I just talked about, Nissan, Chevy, and Ford. What have they announced over through the year 2015? Their capacity to build electric vehicles annually. So it starts at 35,000 this year, up to 230,000 by the year 2015. Well, we said, you know, companies are real fond of saying, you know, we can build, but who's going to buy? So we looked at who's forecasting sales. Global Insight, J.D. Power, and us. We put our finger in the wind once in a while and say what's going to happen. Sales forecasts are at their peak in 2015, 140,000. 140,000 cars sold. You know what the size of the market is going to be in 2015? 14 million or beyond. This is 1%. 1% of the cars is what this represents. This is a good guess. 1%. So 99% of the other cars have to be something else. Here's the disconnect right here. So we're putting a lot of money in this is where I'm getting to. The government's putting a lot of money into this. And here's the payoff, 140,000 vehicles. Is this going to solve the energy climate change problem? I'll leave that to you. Maybe the federal government will by buying lots of vehicles. They certainly put a lot of money in. In the last couple of years, like I said, they put a lot of money in to prop up General Motors and Chrysler. Much needed money, and I can get into a side conversation on that if you want. We had one already last night. Much needed money, a very good investment to help out General Motors and Chrysler. Department of Energy loans, cash for clunkers, another good program. Battery initiative, we heard about that yesterday. A lot of other things. The total's $132 billion the federal government has put into the auto sector in the last couple of years. And what are we getting out of it? A push on electric cars that, you know, at the best guess is going to get 140,000 vehicles sold. The automakers, meanwhile, are taking a lot of that money and saying we're going to, you know, work on more fuel efficient technologies, because the Department of Energy at least had the foresight to say we'll give you some money if you improve the mileage of the vehicle that you're making. It has to be improved by 25%. There has to be a kicker in there. We'll give you some money. And the auto companies just continue to invest anyway. This is what they have to do. They have to spend money to make money. They have to have a new product, otherwise they get left behind. So we've seen $11 billion in investments in plants around the Great Lakes just last year. This is for an industry that, if many of you just read the headlines, you think is dead or dying. They're investing $11 billion in new infrastructure, equipment, processes, and products. Annually, the auto industry spends close to $18 billion in R&D, separate from anything that came from the government. And look at who's spending it. Michigan, Ontario, Ohio, Indiana. These are major amounts of investment in new technologies. All right, so that's one soapbox, and I know I'm getting very close on time, and so the last few slides will go pretty quickly. Supply chain and disruptions. the other leg, transports and fuels, they were already concerned before the earthquake. Why do we have a global supply chain in an era of $100 a barrel oil and, you know, $4 and escalating per gallon price of gas? Why do we source from China, from East Europe, and bring parts here when we could be building them here? Whose smart idea was that? I hate to say, it might be some of you guys. I'm serious. You know, you advise people how to make money, right? You know, you can move it over there, you can make some money because it's cheaper, you know, blah, blah, blah. But all of a sudden, now I'm starting to see on the financial newsletters is that, hey, maybe you ought to be a little bit closer in. You can save some money. Wow. So we think rethinking globalization? I think so. Sole sourcing from suppliers, we need some redundancy. We need some regional ability to build vehicles. North America, Asia, Europe. It ought to be self-sufficient, each one of those three markets. We concentrated too much production in key suppliers. One factory went down that made microchips that supplied 60% of the entire globe. That factory is wiped out. So why is it just there in Japan? You know, can't we build can't we have a clean room here in Cleveland? Are we too stupid? No, we're not. So these are the talks I give to communities and states and folks, and say, look, if you want to spend some money, you know, start hammering on these companies that are selling their cars here to produce more of it here. Power disruptions will be ongoing in Japan. Long-term issue for the supply base. It will be readjusted. The supply chain in the auto industry is second to none. They can move freight, you know, very, very well, very efficiently. I don't know why we're moving around the globe. It's probably to show you that we can do it. So it takes 30,000 parts to build a car. We always like to say you can't build 99% of the car. You can't omit a part. You can't sell it with 3 wheels instead of 4. So you need them all. Consolidation of suppliers increases the risk. There's just a whole host of these. I'm going to make these things available. I don't know if you distribute these along, but there's a lot of good points on there. And finally, industry's energy demands. Reliance and co-location are not by coincidence. The auto industry depends on huge amounts of energy to power its plants. And the industry grew up where there was an abundance of inexpensive energy, relative. So here's a good map, right? The red dots are the auto industry. The black dots are the coal-burning power. We drill in a little bit deeper. This is not by coincidence. It just did, you know, it didn't just happen because somebody just threw a bunch of plants down. They need the power. They need tremendous amounts of power. It's getting, you know, regulations on the horizon. This is a threat. You know, admire Ontario saying we're not going to do coal anymore. If you've got a substitute and you can get it to the industry for a decent price that's comparable, that's fine. You can't just do it here. You just can't wipe coal out of the equation like they want to do on the East Coast and the West Coast, because the industry that drives the economy of this region and drives the economy of the United States depends on this power. Take it out of the equation, a lot of those red dots will go away. We like to say life cycle of an automobile. People say, well, you know, the car is the problem. Of all its CO2 emissions, 75 to 85% of it is from driving it around, okay? The average life of a motor vehicle on the road right now is 10 years and growing, 10 years. So actually, it's 7.5% per year. To build that sucker is up to 25% of the emissions, and that happens in the first year. So that's where I think the solution lies. Get the supply chain closer, work with the companies to green them up, supply some cleaner power, you know, and you can stop picking on the motor vehicle itself. The vehicle is a fantastic technology, and I could go on. But anyway, I think a comprehensive, holistic solution is needed. No one industry or sector can solve the energy dilemma. Improve drivetrain technologies, fuel choices, full palette of energy generation choices, regionalize the supply chain, certainly work with communities, states, provinces, capitalize on foundational strengths. You know, I want to point out too, the DOE person yesterday was very proud of the fact that by 2015, with the money that the Department of Energy is pumping into developing batteries, by 2015, you'll have a battery in your car that can have a range of 100 miles, 100-mile range by 2015, and it'll only cost you $10,000. I wonder what a die-hard replacement will cost, right? When you go into Sears and say, I need a new battery, what are you going to do? Throw the car away or what? I don't see that as a major advancement, and I don't see that as a good place to spend billions and billions of dollars. I think there can have a Midwest renaissance through green manufacturing. This region can position itself in, you know, for the 21st century going forward, environmentally progressive, economically competitive. We can sustain employment at living wages. We can adapt, you know, and brownfields, reusing a lot of the infrastructure that's out there right now. And we can capitalize on the innovation and technology. With that, I'm going to stop. I could say a lot more, as you can imagine. But so thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Kim. And now we'll go straight to Benjamin. It's all about the Benjamins here.
Yeah.
Eventually. In the end.
I think I blew past my 20 minutes. I saw the 3 minutes.
That's all right. As long as we end by 10:15 and have a break, they'll be happy. They're not going to ask more questions than I'm awake.
Morning, everyone.
Yeah, you're doing pretty well.
We recently published, after some 2 years of work, close to 2 years of work, a report on sustainable freight transportation. But before I just get into that, I just wanted to say that we did our launch in Washington on March 31st. And just at that time, the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee of the Congress was holding hearings on the future transportation bill. And they had some 40 experts there. And each expert had something like 4 minutes to speak. And that was it. And there were stakeholders from industry, NGOs, from other experts around the country. We cover a much larger geographic zone, North America, so I'm going to take a little more time than 4 minutes, if you don't mind, just to, to present the facts. The Commission for Environmental Cooperation, I think most of you know us or know something about us. We're set up in 1994 when the NAFTA agreement was finally approved by Congress and in the United States and in Canada and Mexico. And in order to get the agreement passed, at the time Clinton, who was the president, realized that he needed as much of the Democratic vote in the Congress as possible. It ended up being actually voted by a Republican majority in Congress, but he wanted to make sure that he had enough of the Democratic support. So there were two side agreements that were signed, one on labor and one on the environment, and the environment created the secretariat for which I'm working with right now. In the agreement, the side agreement was signed as an article, which is called Article 13, which allows the Secretariat to carry out independent research that doesn't necessarily have to be approved ahead of time by the three governments. It's supposed to support sort of innovation in research in the environment. So we carried out this research on sustainable freight transportation. It's the 7th report that the Commission and Secretariat has put out. Some of the other reports were on the impact of genetically modified corn, maize, which you could imagine was fairly controversial, probably the most controversial report that was put out by the Secretariat, because it did not get a very good reception in the part of the United States, who wrote a lengthy letter attached to the report, basically disclaiming much of what was said in the report. So it can become controversial, but I don't think we're in that sphere this time. In fact, there was total support from the governments on the work that we've done. And some of the last reports included a report on the electricity sector, and the previous report to the one that we're producing today is on green buildings. Oop. Why did we choose, I think, to do work on sustainable freight transportation? The first report, I said, the last report we did was on green buildings. The theme, if you will, was on greenhouse gas emissions, and the sectors that are most impacting our three national economies and the world, in fact, in terms of producing greenhouse gas emissions. And while the debate has changed to some degree, when we started this project 2 years ago, you'll remember the context was very different. We're talking about climate change, we're talking about cap and trade. Everything seemed to be on a forward-moving, symmetrical motion, and that we're moving towards those areas. And in fact, agreements will be put forward and solutions found. Green buildings was identified by the IPCC, who remember produced some of it controversial issues with regards to climate change. But green buildings was the initial area where energy and the most mitigation could be applied very quickly. That was the lowest hanging fruit on the evaluation that was carried out. The second was transportation. So we decided the first effort we put out was on the green buildings. The second we thought on transportation. Now, we thought we'd do transportation, but when we started looking at transportation sector in North America, we realized very quickly that we needed to focus our attention, that we didn't have the capacity to deal with all transportation sector. And we thought that in dealing with transportation, the one issue that seems to impact the three countries most directly in relationship to trade was freight. Freight was the lifeline, if you will, between the three countries, Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. We put together a panel. I mean, how do you go about carrying out a research and developing recommendations to the three governments for the three countries on a continental scale? We had to put together a panel that included industry, that included academia, experts, institutional representation, private sector. So you could imagine the challenge just in putting together an advisory group. If we wanted, we could have probably had 70 people on that group. We decided to limit the number of participants because we wanted something that we could work with. We included in the advisory group FedEx, as you see. We included Walmart. When we focused on Walmart Mexico because we had FedEx from the U.S. We wanted to have a balance between the three countries. We had some NGOs. We had Pollution Probe from Canada. We had Sierra Club in the U.S. Sierra Club told us, we'll join your advisory group only if the unions come in. So we decided, sure, we don't have any problems with that. So we had a group representing a coalition of unions from Washington called the Change to Win, which included the Teamsters and others. We had the Environmental Defense Funds, Railroad Association of Canada, and so on and so on. I invite you to read the report that you all got. You'll see inside we've got a fairly extensive list of people who we consulted in the three countries. The advisory group was not the only group that formed the basis of our consultation. We had a two-track approach. We realized that this is a report that we're submitting to the government. We want the government authorities to react to the report. We wanted to ensure we're not off the map when we finally produce the report. And we also wanted to ensure that we include the major stakeholders within government. So we also had some 60 government officials that we consulted in the three countries. So we carried out consultations in Mexico with the Department of Transportation and Environment of Mexico. We did the same thing in Washington with DOT, Commerce, with EPA, and including the different states that are border states. So in the case of the U.S., we had California, Washington State, New York, New Jersey. We had Texas. Did the same thing in Canada, same process with Canadian officials, and the 10 provinces in this case participated. So we'd have the morning session with the officials in an office and a conference call with the various state representatives. In the U.S., that included port authorities. We had the Port Authority of Los Angeles and New York State. And so I think we were fairly exhaustive in our consultation process, and including public meetings that we had in the three countries. So you can see why it would take, I think this was the quickest report that's been done at the Commission, but it still took us close to 2 years to complete. If you don't mind, I'm going to skip a little bit closer to the conclusion, straight to some of the findings that we had related to this consultation we carried out. Recently, just as we were rolling out the report in Washington, Secretary LaHood was following up on President Obama's plan announcement on energy security, and he said, the transportation sector accounts for 2/3 of the United States oil use and contributes 1/3 to the nation's greenhouse gas emissions. We have an opportunity and an obligation to take action. So there is a recognition from the three governments and from officials in the three governments, from stakeholders, of the importance of moving forward on the transportation sector. And if you look at the map that we have here, those are the main corridors. This is where 90% of the trade will take place between the three countries and movements of freight, including road and rail. And I should say that in carrying out our report, we did focus essentially on road and rail. We realized that the inland waterways and marine was an important contribution. Air cargo is a spectacularly growing sector and a large source of challenge in terms of mitigation of greenhouse gases. But I would say 85 to 90% of our focus was on road and rail. The report identifies several key challenges that I will try to touch on briefly. First among these is the challenge of growth. NAFTA zone population is expected to grow from 460 to 540 million people by 2030 and 600 million by 2050. The North American economy, notwithstanding the downturn that we recently had, and you can see things starting to pick up in all the three countries. I mean, Mexico has a growth rate of about 5% or more GDP per year. And I don't know if I guess there's a lot of misconception about Mexico. We hear a lot about the violence in Mexico. We hear a lot about poverty in Mexico. But in fact, Mexico's average income is twice that of Brazil. So it's a huge and growing economy with a huge and growing middle class. North American economy will grow by 70 to 130% between 2005 and 2030. U.S. interstate highway travel demand measured in vehicles miles traveled will increase from 690 billion to 1.3 trillion miles traveled. Measured in trucks, that's another 1.8 million trucks. And I think this is an important issue to focus on. And I'm not denying that we're going to be putting out more regulations, increasing efficiency in both auto sector and trucking sectors, and I'll be speaking to that in a few seconds. But we're talking about capacity. How much capacity, how is this capacity shortfall that we have in our infrastructure going to impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of pollution, in terms of some of the health issues related to, to the transportation sector? By value, about 88% of U.S. trade with Canada and Mexico moves on land. And I don't have to tell you that. Most of you are aware that living on the border, especially Canada-U.S., as you see, 1/2 of the total truck traffic was handled in 3 ports of entry in North America. 1/2 of all the truck, thank you, of all the truck traffic in North America is handled in 3 different crossings. Detroit, Windsor, Buffalo, Niagara Falls, you're all aware of that, and Laredo, Nuevo Laredo. Those are the main ports of crossing. For the full year 2010, U.S. surface transportation trade with its North American trade partners in Canada and Mexico shot up a record of 24.3% versus calendar year 2009. The U.S. DOT confirmed this in the trade report issued this March 17th. 2010, in fact, was the largest increase, annual percentage gain, since the NAFTA agreement was signed in 1994. So you see the rebound in the economy in the U.S., Mexico, and the United States, in the U.S., Canada, and the United States, sorry, having its impact very quickly in terms of transportation and freight movements across the 3 countries. As you explained, Kim, we're on a common supply chain. Autos that are built in Detroit or Windsor, or parts are coming from Mexico. I mean, sometimes if you took a car, I think it was Stephen Blank in one of his presentations had a diagram of cars with flags attached to each part in the car. And it's just incredible. It's a seamless supply chain in some ways, in building, in the automotive sector, in the aeronautic sector, and many, many sectors of our industries. The 3 countries, in fact, are integrated in terms of supply chain. Now, you'll see by tonnage, interestingly enough, I'm sure none of you would have answered that if I asked you the question, which form of transportation, in fact, carries the largest tonnage, and you'll see the pipeline. So that goes back to the issue that was addressed by the ambassador yesterday. Pipelines are an important issue, but it's not a sector that we focused on. Some of the findings then, in terms of the impact on freight. The transportation sector in North America is only second to electricity generation in terms of CO2 emissions produced. U.S. freight alone emissions increased between 1990 and 2008 by 74%. So it's a huge swath of problems that we face and challenges we face in terms of greenhouse gases. It doesn't mean that we're not doing anything about it, but it just means that we definitely have a challenge in dealing with this. Fuel standards alone will not solve the problem. I mean, it's for sure technology, fuel standards that we apply, and the issues around fuel are important contributors. But if we're looking at just in terms of volume, and this is, I think, the key here, some of the projections that we've looked at and some of the reports that we've seen, one from the U.S. Department of Transportation, shows that, in fact, in light-duty vehicles, greenhouse gas emissions, looking into from 2007 to 2030, we see a 12% decline in terms of contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. While in the freight sector, on the other hand, we show projections of 20% increase. So while we're succeeding in a number of areas, in the automobile, lightweight trucking vehicles, in the heavy-duty truck movement of freight, we do have a challenge. And it's a challenge that both the U.S., Canada, and Mexico understand. In fact, President Obama announced just recently, and last year, in fact, in the first memorandum, announcing that by 2012, 2014, heavy-duty trucks will have to reduce and be more efficient in terms of impact on the environment and the production of emissions and greenhouse gases. Canada followed suit practically the next day. I think at the time the Minister of Environment, Jim Prentice, was visiting a Canadian Tire store in Vancouver and announced Canada will harmonize with the United States. I mean, it was, for sure it was discussed beforehand, but it did sound a little bit impromptu the way it came out. But this was negotiated before, and in fact, Canada has been working with the U.S. in ensuring that both in the heavy-duty truck and light vehicles, light-duty trucks, we do have a harmonized emissions regulatory environment. And our efforts are also to bring Mexico into the fore, because in the Mexican situation, we're not going to stop airflows at the border like we try to stop trucks or people. Air just moves without distinction of border, and we're in one geographic zone. So it is important that we have common policies to deal with the environment. That was the intention, in fact, of setting up the commission in the first place. Some of the challenges we face, very quickly. You know, you've addressed some of these things yesterday in a general broad ways in dealing with carbon issues and so forth. Inadequate coordination among transportation agencies is a major issue, and that not only deals between the three countries, but it's also state-to-state level, municipal, province to province. We've got, you know, we're in a federative system. Each of the countries is a federal structure. Both Mexico, even though Mexico may be a little more centralized in terms of policy, it remains a federal structure. So is Canada and the U.S. And it is often difficult to create national standards, you know, that can be applied. That it requires agreements between provinces, between states, and so forth. So we do have a challenge there. We have a major issue with regards to the impact of planning transportation infrastructure and the issue of land use. And some movements are coming forward. I know in California they've got some legislation that would require any kind of infrastructure development to include
land use planning. So that is moving in the right direction. Inadequate funding for transportation infrastructure, this is a common theme. It comes back to haunt us quite a bit. We have to realize that we're in a competitive environment when it comes to trade and transportation. The European bloc is moving much quicker in terms of integrating and investing, major investments in terms of infrastructure developments. Just to give you an idea, China last year spent 9% of its GDP in infrastructure. India, 3.5% of its GDP. The U.S., less than 1%. But of course, you know, in terms of scale and dollar worth, it's not a comparative analysis that's going to work, but it just gives you an indication of where we have to move. What are some of the key recommendations that after we've done our analysis, and I think the unique thing about this report is the only one, and we've gone through, when we did our research, I think we went through some 140 reports that were produced on sustainable freight transportation and freight-related issues over the last 2 years. So there have been a lot of reports, there have been a lot of commissions that were set up. This is the only report that deals, I think, with North America as a transportation system. And I think that's important to focus on this. I think this is a message that we need to bring forward to some of the policymakers in our 3 countries. Now, there have been efforts, I should say, before I get into the recommendation, just one comment. There has been an effort in 2008 as part of the SPP. There was, I think at the time, was Lawrence Cannon was Minister of Transportation in Canada, coming out of the Montebello meeting, announced that there should be a meeting of the 3 transportation ministers to look at North American transportation system as a whole. Those meetings never were carried through. To my knowledge, I've never been able to find any kind of memo information that the officials from the 3 governments actually followed through on this. There were elections, there were changes, ministers changed, governments changed. The initiative fell through. So the first recommendation that we make in our report is the need to have a forum of ministers of transportation and the environment that meet annually to discuss transportation policies in the 3 countries. And I think it's really important. I think you've got Canada has an initiative called Gateways and Corridors at the Transportation Department. The U.S. is reviewing a major transportation bill which will define how the transportation system develops over the next few years. Mexico is moving into major investments in infrastructures in roads, rail, and ports. Unless we sit together, this is a one transportation system in North America. And unless we sit together, we're not going to have as competitive, efficient, and a sustainable system as we want to have. And this is going to impact on energy, it's going to impact on greenhouse gases, it's going to impact on fuel use. Let me conclude very quickly, taking too much time. We discussed the carbon price issue. I think just to go back to yesterday's, because I tried to step into the last part of the discussion yesterday on carbon. And very quickly, this was an issue that we had a member from the OECD, and the first thing he said was, you've got to have a price on carbon. And everybody around the table from industry and everywhere said, yeah, we agree, but we want to talk about other things. So North America, as opposed to Europe, is not something that comes from the top down. It's something that comes from the bottom up. You've got to get all the stakeholders, all the different parts and regions of the country to agree on a common theme. It's kind of more difficult than what goes on in the European Union. So anyways, we decided for purposes of efficiency to move a little bit away from a major discussion, but we recognized that the stakeholders did agree that we need to have some sort of signal to both for investment purposes and for marketing purposes on carbon. The third recommendation, of course, was that we need to improve efficiency by investing much more in terms of technology and so forth, that we need to have that investment in order to move forward. The fourth main issue is more cross-border collaboration. Empty miles, you know, too many trucks, too many movements of freight are inefficient, that we need better logistics between the three countries in terms of ensuring that we have less empty miles, that we have, maybe we should start dealing with some of the cabotage rules, you know, maybe open skies is a good format to think about. When we did that in the airline industry, maybe we can apply some of those concepts to the freight sector and transportation sector. Training and eco drivers, I'll go to the next one also, on sharing data. Just generally to summarize, we've got some great initiatives. In the U.S., you have the Smart Ways program, which is a voluntary program to support the freight sector to develop and integrate new technologies to become more efficient. It's been a very, very successful program. In Canada, you have what's called Fleet Smart, which is a driver training program that has an impact of between 5 and 10% in terms of reduction of greenhouse gases just by improving driving skills in the drivers and so forth. There's a memorandum of agreement now between the U.S. SmartWays EPA and Fleet Smart to integrate both programs and to promote both programs in both U.S. and Canada, and we're working with Mexico and trying to get them to participate as well. And it'll be easy in Mexico because in Canada we work on a metric system, so they can just adapt it quite easily in Mexico, and the U.S. is developing other techniques that will support that kind of work. And the last issue is, I'm sorry that I'm taking so much time here. The last issue is on data and data gathering. I think it's important to understand that unless we have proper information that can be used by the three governments for the three countries that have some congruence in terms of analyzing the situation. I mean, when we started doing this research project, we could not get basic information that's comparable between Canada and the U.S. and between Canada and the U.S. and Mexico. Different definitions on what is a light or a heavy-duty truck, what is a freight transportation, and so forth. So we need to have common indexes between the three countries. I think we can do it. It's not a major channel. There has been efforts between the three statistical institutes in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, and we need to support it by government policy. Thank you very much.
This has been it's a very good discussion. There's a lot on the table. We have some time for questions. If you remember the drill from yesterday, come to a microphone, tell us who you are, and ask your question so that the nice folks up front can get it for the record. I'm going to take advantage of the chair just to sort of start you two off. It seems to me there's a connection between the things that you were both saying. Kim, you were talking about a global supply chain that has a certain illogic to it with transportation costs rising because of fuel costs. And Benjamin, you were talking about the transportation infrastructure being weak and also the need to be near where energy sources are. Are we about to see not a government-led sort of drive for efficiency, but an industry-led drive that consolidates the industry geographically to deal with some of the supply chain issues and to address, Benjamin, what you're talking about, some of the sustainability issues with freight? Or do you think that's maybe too optimistic? How would you see the drivers here and this change?
Well, I think we are seeing a change, and you know, in the absence of any defined government policy, like I started out saying, Exxon and BP are setting our policy for us by increasing the transportation costs, and there's nothing like getting a private sector to respond than to start ballooning a line item on the cost sheet for them, and they will start attacking it. So I think it is happening. You know, for years we were talking in our office about these global supply chains and where is the risk in the equation. We saw the equation: transportation cost, freight in, freight out, you know, blah blah blah, cost of labor, everything. Every argument was thrown up there, and we said, where's the risk component in this thing? Oh, well, risk, you know, the risk of some disruption in the supply chain was very, very small. But as we saw, the probability is very small. But of an event, the cost is enormous. And so I think that we're embarking on an era, I can predict this, that we're going to re-examine why we would globalize, how we have.
And Benjamin, do you think that the governments are going to be able to get ahead of this, or will they be playing catch-up based on what you've seen?
Well, I think the challenge is nearshoring is happening. I mean, it was happening even before the 2008 recession. Manufacturing stats in the United States were starting to increase. I don't know if everybody paid attention to it, and I think we're going to see that trend continue, which is probably a great thing in terms of better energy use and so forth. The problem really is we're still not going to reduce the amount of trade. It's a question of volume. It's relative volume. So trade is increasing, populations are increasing, globalization is going to be there even if we have nearshoring and more of the manufacturing of goods takes place in North America, but capacity is just not there. We're not investing sufficiently in the infrastructures in each of the countries to different degrees, and we're not talking to each other in terms of planning. So if the Panama Canal increases in terms of opportunities for larger ships to come through, container ships, and maybe new ports develop capacities in the United States and so forth, and less on the West Coast, not less in a relative sense, we remain in a situation where infrastructures have to be built there, roads, rail, whatever, to enable that movement to take place. Now, there's a lot of things going on at the same time. Inland ports are being developed to redistribute and warehousing and so forth, but the capacity issue from everything that we've seen in terms of data is heading towards a fairly quickly in terms of crisis of our capacity to handle those movements in an efficient and competitive sense.
Quite serious. Minister Peterson.
Jim Peterson, Benjamin, very briefly, did you look at the possibility of long combination vehicles, one tractor, two 53-foot trailers? And if so, how much how much can they save in terms of greenhouse gases?
Well, we looked at it in terms because of just basically because the stakeholders around the table raised it as an issue fairly regularly, but it came up now and then. The problem in a lot of that regulatory environment regarding weight and size are state controlled. So you know, in Canada, I think it's over 100,000 pounds per trailer. In the U.S., it
just means you have two trailers as opposed to one.
I know, but regulatory issues are both state control. There's also issues about safety.
We've looked at that on Ontario and Quebec, and Quebec allows it. Ontario is testing it right now, and will probably allow it very soon.
And this is exactly goes to exactly some of the two recommendations we make. The first one, we need the three transportation government officials and environment ministers to meet on a regular basis, and underneath that, at the same time, practically, we need a forum of stakeholders to discuss those issues with those decision makers to ensure that we have national standards that meet those interests and reduce and increase efficiency.
Kim, very briefly, with China being the fastest growing market for automobiles, how can we repeal globalization? Through volume, they're going to have much cheaper costs for components.
We don't need to repeal it. We're doing what we're doing. General Motors is one of the largest sellers of motor vehicles in China. And so we co-locate. You know, the auto industry is great at scaling up operations. We don't need to make them all in one place and ship them elsewhere. And China is trying to develop the infrastructure, the manufacturing processes, the power generation to be able to build enough cars to meet the demand of their domestic market. People are talking about, well, what happens when the Chinese start exporting cars over here? Well, they're going to have to catch up with demand in their own country before they even think about supplying over here. And we've seen it time and time again that a company or a company based overseas says, well, we're going to go to the North American market. You know, Toyota, Honda, the Koreans, the Germans all started importing vehicles here. They caught on, and very quickly, by the time they get to about 1% market share here in the U.S., they decide they're going to build an operation here and then build up the supply infrastructure. So China is just another data point out there.
Michael.
Michael Robinson from Fasken Martineau in Toronto. A question for Benjamin. I only read one annual report a year. It's by some fairly successful investor called Buffett in Berkshire Hathaway annual report. And last year I noticed that he thought it was a good idea to buy a little railroad.
BNSF.
Yeah, he had a few $1 billion lying around and he needed to do
26
something with
billion,
it.
yeah.
And some of the comments here about the amount of freight, cost per mile, and barrels of diesel used by rail compared to truck made me wonder why your report didn't say much about rail. And I thought, well, that must mean that Buffett's even smarter than everybody thought, because the rail system is so good and so good for the environment that it doesn't need improvement. It's these darn trucks. So can you tell us a little more? I mean, does that make
well,
sense?
we did focus on rail as well. Not as much as we focused on perhaps on the trucking issue to some extent, but I think we tried to parcel out both. We focused on intermodal shifts as one opportunity to reduce greenhouse gases for sure. Rail is definitely a lower emitter of greenhouse gases, more efficient. I mean, steel on steel works a lot better than the roadways. But we also noticed from speaking to shippers and carriers that the decision to use one mode or another is driven by the market. And no matter how we look, and even BNSF, if you look at BNSF, 30% of their, I think it's about 30% of their merchandise that they carry on rail is coal. So it's a coal, you know, I mean, how do we then define greenhouse gas impact and then footprint and so forth? I didn't want to get into that discussion, and I'm not trying to. I think rail is an important part of it. We've got, you know, overall, and I said it to some people yesterday, I said, even though our report is focused on improving sustainability in the freight sector, the secret, we can speak amongst ourselves, the freight system in North America is probably one of the most efficient in the world. It's not that it's inefficient, it's just that we have to maintain our competitive edge, our efficiency, and reduce greenhouse gases from freight by intermodal and modal shifts if we can, where we can. Some of these, the buildings of these inland ports, in fact, address that issue. So there is, you know, trucking and rail, you know, they compete, but they're also realize that they need each other in terms of transportation system as a whole. And there's, if there are incentives that are put out there that can, and that's a question the governments have to decide. How much money are they willing to put out to improve the infrastructure? What kind of incentives are they ready to provide? Because the margin under which some of these trucking firms work is very, very low, very low. I mean, that's one of the issues we've had with the Mexican-U.S. trucking issue, and I think I'm not off the record or on the record, but you know, the part of the reaction in the union movement in the United States is to protect independent drivers who make approximately $28,000 a year, driving, you know, 10 to 15 hours a day. So we have some major issues with the way market forces work. And for sure, the issue of intermodalism is something that we tried to address in the report.
I might also add, you know, when you look at the auto sector, you know, you make a great point, but again, to make an automobile takes thousands of parts coming from hundreds, if not thousands, of smaller companies that feed into that one central location. So it doesn't make any sense to have 1,000 rail lines coming from all sorts of different directions. However, you know, when General Motors or Chrysler builds engines in Mexico and installs them into motor vehicles in Sterling Heights, there's a train that comes directly from Mexico loaded up with engines, and then those cars are built, the cars are put on them, they're taken to a central location and then distributed. So, you know, it is an intermodal effect. That rail is used, you know, where it makes the most sense, and then trucks to you know, do the micro distribution of things. So
The last mile.
the last mile, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, ladies and gentlemen, oh, David, did you want to jump in, please?
Question. David Crane. I share your views on electric vehicles. I don't think we're betting
Did I make
heavily-
myself clear?
I think we're betting heavily on technology that isn't going to help. But I was a bit concerned about your dismissive, what seemed to be a dismissive view of hydrogen fuel cells. I was struck by two things. One was that when the Obama administration tried to slash support for fuel cell R&D, but it was the automobile companies that mounted a very strong campaign to get that funding restored, and the auto industry is still seems to be pursuing that option quite heavily. And when the National Academy of Sciences reviewed the, I can't remember, it's now called Next Gen Vehicle or Future Gen, you know what I'm talking about, though.
Yeah.
They emphasized the importance of maintaining the investment in the hydrogen program because they still saw that
Yeah.
as a longer term possibility that if we have electric vehicles, it's a transition kind of thing. My question, though, was had to do with, you made a comment, I think I'm reflecting it accurately, that with the price of oil going over $100 a barrel, and did it make sense to have these global supply chains? And what I didn't hear was what difference that additional cost in the price of oil really makes to the price of the final delivered product of the component. In other words, if you're shipping electric cable systems or cars from China and the price of oil goes up, how much does that affect the price of what you're importing from China? Is it energy of 5% or 3% of the cost? What does it amount to?
Well, right. The interesting thing is that one of the reasons that was seen as moving offshore is to reduce the cost of labor going into to make a motor vehicle. The percentage of labor cost of building an entire automobile is less than 10%. And so we started to say, you know, that doesn't make sense, because maybe you're going to save a little bit on labor, but you're only going to knock off a percentage or two. 85% of the cost is on procuring parts for it, and the movement, and the transport is cooked into that. I don't know what to pull out just the transportation component. And I know on a piece by piece by piece basis, sometimes it does make sense because somebody somewhere has developed a process that can make them unbelievably cheap. Some of the suppliers that we know of would prefer to have 2 or 3 locations globally and ship everywhere else, because that's their cheapest way of doing it, is to scale up an enormous plant making these things and going ahead and doing that. Some cases it does make sense, and I'm not saying you just cut the umbilical cord completely. What I'm talking about are key components to motor vehicles. It makes no sense to have one plant in Japan making 60% of the microchips that are used globally by industries globally in one location. And the auto industry is a huge consumer of these microchips. And so why aren't we making them here? Back to your other point, though, and I'm sorry if I was dismissive about fuel cells. I do think fuel cells have an enormous potential. My point is that Department of Energy and the Obama administration picks a technology. Remember I started out saying that believe it or not, the politicians aren't the smartest group of people. They're not the ones to go and pick a technology. What they should say, here's our goal for energy efficiency, for reductions of emissions. You as a private sector company, go out there, we'll enable it, but we're not going to tell you which technology. I think fuel cells are fabulous. And my point is that we're spending billions and billions and billions on building up a battery infrastructure for 1% of the market. And what's not being invested, and I had to scribble in my notes, what's not being invested in are fuel cells, diesel, compressed natural gas. You're absolutely right. When the Obama administration zeroed it out, which the Bush administration had a lot of funding going toward development of fuel cells, the Obama administration zeroed it out, and Honda, for one, led the charge on that, because they do have some prototype fuel cell vehicles that are on the road in California right now. And it's 10 years out because, the cost of it, it's kind of like fuel exploration. There's always a 20-year supply of fuel, because it makes sense. There's not a 30-year supply of fuel because the cost structure doesn't make enough sense to go and find 30 years worth of supply. But as the 20-year supply goes down to 10 and the cost of fuel goes up, they start digging in the ground and exploring for more, and lo and behold, we find more fuel. Same thing here is that, if we invest in fuel cells more and more and more, we're going to get some return on it finally. But right now, it's just, you know, it's $1 million for a car with a fuel cell on it. So, you know, are you going to buy that, or are you going to buy a cruise that's built down there in Lordstown for $15,000 or $18,000?
Well, we were talking about lead times, and there is a lead time for the next panel. We have 10 minutes, so go out, get coffee, expect the bell in 10. Thanks very much to our panel. This has been terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you.